Stick to cornfields, Victor. Aviation is for people who can afford it.
You should have afforded an FAA clearance.
Some people look at a piece of land and see nothing but raw, rentable square footage, a blank slate of taxable real estate to be divided, paved, and flipped for a tidy profit. They see setbacks, zoning permits, easements, and lines on a map that can be shifted with the stroke of a corrupt pen or the grease of a developer's palm. They look at a valley and think only of how many modern luxury units can be crammed onto its floor, how many manicured lawns can be coaxed into existence with chemical treatments, and how much they can charge in monthly maintenance fees to keep the messy, unpredictable parts of the world out. But to those whose blood, sweat, and generations have soaked into the clay before the county even had a registry office, land is not an asset. It is a ledger. It is a living, breathing history that records every seed sown, every drought survived, every flood that swept through the creek, and every foolish modern hand that ever tried to draw a boundary where the earth never intended one to exist. Victor Vance came back from the sky to find that some people had completely forgotten how to read that ledger. The heat of the high plains was oppressive, a heavy, thick weight that smelled of dry corn husks, baking dust and oncoming ozone from a storm building over the western mountains. Victor's Ford F-250 diesel pickup truck rumbled softly as it pulled up the long gravel driveway of the Vance farm, its oversized tires crunching over the dry limestone with a familiar, comforting rhythm that felt like a heartbeat. For 18 long months, Victor had been away deployed as a fighter pilot in the Naval Reserves flying multi-million-dollar supersonic jets through the crisp, clean, and different layers of the stratosphere. He had grown used to the sterile, mathematical precision of tactical displays, the quiet hum of life support, and the vast, silent curvature of the earth at 50,000 feet. Down here, the world was supposed to be simpler, grounded, and tangible. It was supposed to smell of wet loam sweet alfalfa feed, oil from his grandfather's ancient tools, and the sweet starchy scent of the family's heritage sweet corn. But as Victor stepped out of the cab, shutting the heavy steel door with a solid metallic thud that echoed off the wooden barns, his nose twitched. He smelled something else, something sharp, synthetic, hot, and entirely foreign to the valley. Asphalt, cool, fresh, oily asphalt. He walked past the old, weathered timber of the main barn, his heavy leather boots sinking slightly into the soft clay of the path. When he rounded the corner of the equipment yard, his jaw tightened. His eyes, trained to spot minor anomalies on a flight deck from miles away, locked onto a sight that made his blood run cold. Where 15 acres of his grandfather's prize-winning heritage, sweet corn, had stood 18 months ago, there was now a flat, glistening sea of black tar. It stretched out like a long, dark, unnatural scar across the valley floor, shimmering under the heat haze and reflecting the bright blue of the sky like a mirror of pure oil. Before he could even step onto the encroaching tarmac to examine the property line, a high-pitched, electric vo-vo-vo sound cut through the quiet rustle of the dry cornfields. An expensive, custom-painted electric golf cart came whirring around the bend of his southern pasture, its high-end brakes squeaking with self-important sharpness as it came to a halt directly on his land. Behind the steering wheel sat Victoria Sinclair, the president of the Skyline Estates Homeowners Association. She was a woman in her late 50s, wearing a pristine linen tennis outfit that was entirely too white and too clean for a valley that lived on grit and dust. Her hair was a perfect, immovable helmet of sprayed silver, and her face wore the permanent, tight expression of a person who believed her HOA covenants were the highest form of moral law in the Western Hemisphere. Her wrist was adorned with a massive gold wristwatch that caught the sun, flashing a warning signal of wealth and unyielding authority. "Well, well, the prodigal aviator returns to his patch of weeds," Victoria said, her voice dripping with a performative high society elegance that could not quite mask the cold condescension underneath. "Mr. Vance, I presume I was beginning to think we'd have to leave our welcome notices with the crows, or perhaps have them dropped from one of your old-fashioned, noisy flying machines." Victor did not move. He stood with his hands in his pockets, his gaze drifting from her pristine white visor down to the wide turf-shredding tires of her golf cart. "Mrs. Sinclair, you're parked on my drainage ditch. The county easement ends exactly 3 feet behind your rear tires." Victoria let out a short, brittle laugh. It was a practiced socialite chuckle designed to make the recipient feel small, the kind of laugh used to dismiss incompetent caterers or rebellious landscapers. "Oh, Mr. Vance, let's not start this neighborly relationship with petty geometry and property disputes. We have much larger, more beautiful things to discuss." Have you looked behind your barn recently, or did the military teach you only to look straight ahead at the target? I see about 15 acres of black tar where my family's heritage sweet corn used to grow, Victor said. His voice was flat, dangerously calm, carrying the quiet, steady authority of a pilot who had stared down surface-to-air missile radars at 10,000 feet without a flinch. We call it progress, Victoria replied, gesturing grandly with a manicured hand toward the massive strip of asphalt that cut through his property. The Skyline Estates Aviation Club, a premier exclusive fly-in community for the region's elite. Private hangars, custom-designed Italianate villas, and a magnificent $15 million runway that will allow our residents to park their private jets right outside their back doors. Unfortunately, Mr. Vance, your rather rustic, agricultural operation was deemed an aesthetic and operational hazard by our design board. As the president of the HOA, it is my duty to inform you that your outdated crop-dusting aircraft and heavy machinery have been classified as visual pollution under Amendment 14 of the Skyline Covenants. Victor looked at her, his expression entirely unreadable. I don't recall signing any covenants, Victoria. This farm was established by my grandfather in 1948. Your aviation club was a breeding ground for bullfrogs and mosquitoes 3 years ago before you drained the wetlands. The world changes, Victor, and those who do not change with it are swept aside, Victoria said, her smile tightening until it looked like a surgical incision. We have the county zoning board, the regional commissioners, and the finest property attorneys in the state on our side. In fact, since you failed to respond to our registered letters while you were away on your little military excursion, we have taken the liberty of issuing a few corrections. She reached into her designer tennis bag and pulled out a crisp, thick sheet of parchment paper, unfolding it with a slow, deliberate rustle that sounded like dry leaves. Under the newly established runway visual enclosure zone, your farm has been assessed a fine of $12,000 for the unauthorized storage of commercial agricultural waste, by which we mean your antique John Deere tractor and that hideous leaking crop duster. Furthermore, because those vehicles were parked within our designated clearance path, they have been legally impounded by our authorized towing contractor. Victor's eyes narrowed slightly. You towed my plane. We did, Victoria said, her tone absolute and victorious. It is currently sitting in a secure holding yard, accruing $500 a day in storage fees. I suggest you pay the fine, sell this eyesore of a property to our development group. We are offering a very generous 10 cents on the dollar, and find yourself a nice, quiet trailer park where your tractors won't offend people of taste. She engaged the reverse gear of her golf cart, the vehicle emitting a sharp, rhythmic beep as she backed away. Have a wonderful afternoon, Victor, and do pay that fine before the weekend. We would hate to begin foreclosure proceedings on your lovely little cabin. With a final dismissive wave, she whirred away, leaving only the smell of fresh asphalt and the quiet sigh of the wind through the remaining corn. Victor watched her go until the white speck of her tennis outfit disappeared behind the manicured hedges of Skyline Estates. Then he reached down to the collar of his shirt and tapped the small, black button of his radio transmitter. Hank, you on the line? A heavy, static-laced chuckle crackled in his ear. Yeah, boss, I heard the whole thing. She really called the 1954 John Deere visual pollution. I think that tractor has won more blue ribbons at the state fair than her entire family combined. Where's the plane, Hank? Victor asked. Sitting right in Bay 3 of our main impound lot, Hank replied. We used the heavy-duty hydraulic flatbed just like you instructed. Didn't scratch a single speck of paint on the wings. Good, Victor said, his lips twitching into the ghost of a smile. Prepare the invoice for the Skyline Estates HOA. And Hank, make sure you charge them the maximum corporate emergency rate for specialized aviation transport. After all, we wouldn't want to offend people of taste. Vance & Sons Heavy Towing was a quiet family enterprise. For 3 generations, the Vances had operated the largest recovery fleet in the county. What Victoria Sinclair's expensive real estate attorneys had failed to realize during their rapid land acquisition was a very simple, very beautiful municipal detail. Vance & Sons held the exclusive, ironclad municipal contract for all county-ordered vehicle removals. The HOA's private security had called the county dispatch to report an abandoned aircraft, and the county dispatch had, of course, routed the call directly to the only company capable of moving it. The HOA had, in essence, paid Victor's own family company to store Victor's own airplane, and they were currently racking up a bill that would make a corporate lawyer sweat. As the sun began to dip below the western mountains, casting long crimson shadows across the freshly paved runway, Victor walked back to his cabin. He sat on the porch, nursing a cup of black coffee, watching the light fade. The conflict had arrived as he always knew it would. The urban sprawl of the city was creeping up the valley, bringing with it people who wanted the aesthetic of the countryside but hated the smell of manure, the noise of engines, and the independent spirit of the people who worked the land. They wanted to sanitize the world to turn it into a sterile, predictable resort. But Victor was not a man who easily sanitized. He was a man of the sky, but his roots were buried deep in this dirt. He remembered his grandfather telling him that a man who doesn't fight for his land doesn't deserve to walk on it. Victor intended to walk on this land for a very long time, and he intended to do so on his own terms. The silence of the evening was absolute, save for the occasional, distant hum of a lawn-mower from the estates. It was a synthetic peace, a silence maintained by rules and threats. But out here on the Vance farm, the silence was different. It was the deep, patient quiet of things that grow, of soil that waits for the rain, and of a storm that was slowly, inevitably gathering on the horizon. Victor took another sip of his coffee, his eyes fixed on the glistening black runway. Tomorrow, the game would begin in earnest, and he was more than ready to play. There is a particular kind of madness that infects those who live behind gated walls, a delicate, creeping delusion of absolute control. It is the belief that because they have successfully managed to keep the messy, unpredictable parts of the world out, they have also somehow managed to command the very laws of nature. They believe that the air above their heads can be partitioned into neat, rentable air rights, and that the dirt beneath their feet can be bullied into absolute compliance by a board of directors. They believe that money doesn't just buy comfort. They believe it buys gravity physics and the right to dictate how a seed should grow. By Thursday morning, the roar of Victor's crop duster was a rhythmic, thunderous pulse that shook the pristine double-pane glass windows of the Skyline Estates villas. The aircraft, a beautifully restored Grumman Ag Cat with a massive rumbling radial engine, swept low over the southern boundary of the Vance farm, leaving a fine, misty trail of organic liquid fertilizer in its wake. It flew with a terrifying, wild freedom, its wings slicing through the morning air just feet above the property line. To the residents of Skyline, who were currently attempting to enjoy their morning macchiatos and organic green juices on their limestone patios, the plane was a mechanical demon. It was loud, it was oily, and it flew with a complete disregard for their peaceful enjoyment of their multi-million-dollar views. It was a reminder that the world was still wild, noisy, and dirty outside their gates. In her glass-walled office, Victoria Sinclair was in a state of controlled fury. She held her security radio so tightly her knuckles were white. "Get the sheriff's office on the line immediately. He is doing it again. That lunatic is flying that rusted metal monster directly over our organic kale gardens. The chemical drift is ruining the morning tennis matches. Do you hear me? I want him grounded. I want him in handcuffs. He is a public safety hazard." But on the ground, Victor was not looking at the sky. I was standing near the southern fence line with his grandfather, Grandpa Vance. Grandpa Vance was 78 years old with a face that looked like it had been carved out of a dry hickory stump by a dull pocket knife and a voice like gravel scraping over rusted iron. I was a combat engineer from the old school, a man who believed that if a job was worth doing, it was worth over-engineering to the point of absolute absurdity. He had spent his youth clearing roads through hostile jungles and building tactical bridges under heavy artillery fire. And he did not look kindly on people who wore white visors and drove electric carts. "They're coming back, Victor," Grandpa Vance said, squinting through the dust, as three black, highly polished HOA security SUVs lined up along the dirt road that separated the two properties. "They've got cameras on poles, and that young security kid with the clipboard is walking toward the line like he owns the place." "Let them watch, Grandpa," Victor said, leaning against the fender of his truck. "How's the new fence line coming?" Grandpa Vance let out a dry, rattling laugh that sounded like a cold diesel engine trying to start on a winter morning. "Well, those HOA cops kept driving their fancy luxury Jeeps across our south pasture to inspect our barn for visual compliance. They tore up our clover field and didn't even have the decency to close the gate. They think because they're private security, they can act like real police officers with real authority. So I figured we needed a fence that was a bit more educational, something that would teach them a lesson about rangyoi." "What did you use?" Victor asked, a slight smile playing on his lips. You remember that pile of historic 60-pound-per-yard solid carbon steel railway rails we bought from the county liquidation sale 5 years ago? Grandpa Vance asked, his eyes twinkling with old-school combat engineer malice. I took the hydraulic pile driver on the tractor, sank them 6 feet deep into the solid clay, spaced them exactly 4 feet apart, just narrow enough that a Jeep can't squeeze through, but wide enough that the rabbits and the coyotes can still pass. Then I painted the tops a nice bright farm store white, just so they can't say they didn't have fair warning in broad daylight. Down this dirt road, one of the HOA's private security vehicles, a brand new $70,000 luxury Jeep Cherokee with custom gold lettering and flashing amber lights, began to accelerate. The driver, a young man in his early 20s wearing a tactical vest that was entirely too clean, wanted to make a point. He wanted to show these stubborn backward farmers that the authority of Skyline Estates was not to be trifled with. Watch this, Grandpa Vance muttered, spitting a stream of dark tobacco juice into the dry grass. Here comes the hot shot. He likes to do 50 miles an hour across our pasture to scare the heifers and make us look weak. The Jeep roared down the boundary line, its tires kicking up a massive cloud of dust that drifted over the cornfields. The driver leaned out the window, his voice carrying over the sound of the engine. Move that tractor, old man. You're obstructing a designated emergency clearance zone under HOA Regulation 42. The Jeep did not slow down. The driver assumed, as he always did, that the wooden fence posts of the Vance farm would snap like matchsticks under the reinforced bumper of his luxury SUV. He had done it twice before, laughing as the splintered pine gave way and the cows scattered in panic. He did not see the solid carbon steel railway rails hidden behind the thin decorative wooden slats. The collision was magnificent in its physics. There was no screech of tires, no dramatic sliding, just a catastrophic earth-shaking crump of high-velocity metal meeting an immovable geological force. The Jeep's front end did not simply dent, it disintegrated in a fraction of a second. The hood crumpled into a perfect metal accordion, the engine block was driven violently backward into the firewall, and the radiator exploded in a spectacular, wet whoosh of scalding steam and bright green coolant. The security driver's airbag deployed with a loud white puff, leaving him dazed, bruised and smelling of gunpowder, his face pressed against the rapidly deflating nylon. The steel rail, painted a pristine farm store white, did not budge a single eighth of an inch. It stood perfectly straight, a silent vertical monument to the laws of physical mass and old-school engineering. Victor walked slowly toward the steaming wreck, his boots crunching on the shattered safety glass that littered the grass like diamonds. He reached out and tapped his knuckles gently on the driver's side window. "Morning, son," Victor said, his voice mild, conversational, and entirely devoid of anger. "Looks like you're going to need a tow. Don't worry, my family's company, Vance & Sons Heavy Recovery, is just down the road. We charge a very reasonable $300 hookup fee and $150 a mile for emergency extraction from historic railway structures. I'll make sure they don't charge you for the cleanup of the green fluid. We're neighborly like that." The driver could only let out a weak, pathetic groan as the steam from his destroyed radiator slowly drifted into the bright morning sky, leaving a faint scent of burnt oil and hot antifreeze. Grandpa Vance walked up, inspecting the front of the Jeep with a critical, appreciative eye. "Well, Victor, I'd say the structural integrity of our new fence is officially verified by independent testing. Let's head back to the house. Your grandmother made some apple pie, and I'd hate for it to get cold while we're standing around admiring the scrap metal. Tomorrow, we might need to add a few more posts down by the creek. I hear the HOA wants to build a bridge there." As they walked away, Victor glanced back at the wrecked Jeep. He knew this was only the beginning. The HOA had money, they had influence, and most of all, they had an absolute inability to accept defeat. They would try to sue, they would try to get the police involved, they would try to find some loophole in the county bylaws. But Victor also knew that the county has its own rules, and those rules were written long before the first developer decided to call a swamp an exclusive aviation lifestyle community. Arrogance is a slow-acting poison. It begins by convincing you that your bank account is a shield against the universe, and it ends by making you believe that a piece of paper signed by a suburban developer somehow overrides the Constitution of the United States. When you spend your life ordering people to trim their lawns to an exact height of 2.5 inches and issuing fines for non-compliant mailbox designs, you lose the ability to distinguish between a polite neighbor and an immovable object. You begin to believe that your authority is absolute, that your rules apply to everyone, and that the state itself is merely an extension of your board of directors. By Friday afternoon, a dark, heavy thunderstorm had rolled in from the west, turning the sky the color of a bruised plum. The rain began as a low, rhythmic drumming on the tin roof of the Vance aircraft hangar, creating a metallic, echoing roar that filled the vast wooden structure with a sense of isolation and impending conflict. Inside, Victor was sitting on an overturned wooden crate, calmly cleaning the carburetor of his Grumman Ag cat with a kerosene-soaked rag. The smell of oil, old wood, and wet earth was thick in the air, a comforting, honest scent that had defined his family's life for 70 years. Suddenly, the heavy wooden doors of the hangar were pushed open with a violent creak, letting in a cold blast of wet wind and the sound of splashing boots. Victoria Sinclair marched in, flanked by 3 private security guards in yellow rain ponchos and a nervous-looking young man in a gray suit holding a plastic-wrapped clipboard. Her eyes were wide with a frantic, desperate energy, her face flushed with anger. "This ends today, Victor." Victoria shouted, her voice shrill, as she tried to make herself heard over the roar of the rain on the roof. Her pristine tennis visor was gone, replaced by an expensive designer umbrella that was currently dripping water onto Victor's clean concrete floor. "I don't care about your ridiculous steel posts, and I don't care about your towing company. I have brought the County Code Enforcement Division, and we are here to officially condemn and seize this hazardous structure." The young man in the suit took a step forward, his glasses fogging up in the damp air. He looked nervous, his eyes darting around the massive shadow-filled hangar. Mr. Vance, I'm the Assistant Code Enforcement Officer for the county. Mrs. Sinclair has filed an emergency complaint under Section 9 regarding unlicensed fuel storage and the hazardous structural integrity of this barn. She says it's a public safety risk." Victor did not look up from his carburetor. He continued to wipe the metal component with slow, rhythmic strokes of his rag, his hands steady and precise. This barn was inspected and certified by the State Department of Agriculture last September. "Son, the certificate is right behind you on the post next to the portrait of my grandmother. It has a gold seal on it from the state governor. I suggest you read it before you write anything down. I don't care about your archaic agricultural exemptions." Victoria spat, taking a step closer, her heels clicking sharply on the concrete. "This is an active flight path for Skyline Estates. We have private security here to ensure the peace is kept while we board up this fire hazard and seize that unregistered aircraft. We have a signed order from the HOA board." One of her security guards, the supervisor, a burly man with a thick neck, a tactical haircut, and an oversized holster, stepped forward. His leather duty belt creaked loudly as he placed a hand on his Glock pistol, racking the slide with a sharp, heavy click that echoed in the quiet spaces of the barn. "Sir, step away from the equipment. We are securing the premises under the authority of the Skyline Board. Don't make this difficult." Victor slowly stopped wiping the carburetor. He looked at the security guard, his eyes cool, empty, and completely devoid of fear, like the sky before a winter freeze. "Son," Victor said softly, his voice barely louder than a whisper, but carrying a weight that made the guard freeze. "You are currently standing inside a wet, metallic hangar holding a loaded firearm, pointing it at a property owner on his own deeded homestead. I highly recommend you look at the door behind you before you take another breath." "Don't threaten him, Victor!" Victoria shrieked, her voice echoing off the wooden rafters. "We have the law on our side. The sheriff's office is right here, Victoria." A cold, clear voice cut through the damp air like a knife. From the dark corner of the hangar near the old tool room, a woman stepped into the light of the halogen work lamps. She was wearing the dark green, pristine uniform of the county sheriff's department. The heavy brass star on her chest caught the light, gleaming with an authority that did not depend on an HOA vote or a neighborhood covenant. Her name was Sarah Vance. She was Victor's wife, a decorated former military police investigator who had spent 10 years handling high-stakes logistics and law enforcement in active combat zones. She was a woman who knew the law, who knew how to handle armed men, and who possessed an absolute unyielding calm under pressure. Victoria's high society smile froze on her face, her eyes widening in disbelief. "What? Who is this, another one of your farmhands? This is a private civil matter, young woman. Leave immediately, or I will have my security detail escort you off." "I am Sheriff Sarah Vance," Sarah said, her voice like flint striking steel. She walked with a slow, deliberate stride, her boots making no sound on the wet concrete, her hand resting naturally on her service weapon. "I was sworn in by the county judge at exactly 8 o'clock this morning. And you, Mrs. Sinclair, are currently directing an armed group of private citizens to commit aggravated burglary, armed trespass, and brandishing a firearm on a deeded homestead. Victoria's voice dropped an octave, her confidence suddenly leaking out like air from a punctured tire. Her hands began to tremble. Sheriff. No, that's impossible. The previous sheriff, Sheriff Miller, assured us that this was a civil boundary dispute. He was supposed to handle this. He was supposed to be here today. Sheriff Miller retired yesterday afternoon. Sarah said, her voice flat, indifferent, and entirely professional. Right around the time the state prosecutor's office found some interesting irregularities in his campaign ledger, specifically a $50,000 donation from the Skyline Estates Development Group. He's currently assisting the state police with their inquiries down in the Capitol. I don't think he'll be helping you with any more boundary disputes. She stopped 3 feet from the security guard who was still holding his Glock, her eyes locked onto his. Now, son, are you going to put that weapon on the floor, or am I going to have my deputies, who are currently waiting in 3 patrol cars right outside that door, show you what a real arrest looks like? The guard didn't hesitate. The Glock hit the concrete with a hollow metallic clatter sliding across the wet floor until it stopped near Victor's boot. He slowly raised his hands, his face pale under his wet hood. Smart choice, Sarah said, nodding towards the door. Deputy Miller, bring the zip ties. Let's see how much the Skyline Aviation security team enjoys the overnight facilities down at the county jail. I hear the structural integrity of the holding cells is top-notch. They've got real nice concrete walls there. Victoria's face turned the color of curdled milk. She began to scream as the deputy led her guards away in handcuffs, her expensive umbrella falling to the floor in pooling water. You can't do this. My husband is the chief donor for the governor's transport committee. We have $15 million invested in that runway. Tomorrow is our grand opening. We have 3 United States senators coming. You will be ruined. Your farm will be paved over. Victor stood up, tossing his dirty rag onto the crate. He looked at the screaming woman as she was led out into the rain. Tomorrow's forecast is looking real interesting, Victoria, Victor said quietly. I'd suggest you tell your guests to dress for the weather. It's going to be a wet one. The storm outside raged on the wind, howling through the rafters, but inside the hangar, there was only the quiet, steady dripping of water from the wet ponchos. Sarah walked over to Victor, looking down at the carburetor. You almost done with that? Just about, Victor said, smiling. Thanks for the backup, Sheriff. I was starting to think I'd have to clean up a mess. Just doing my job, honey, she said, leaning against the wing of the Ag Cat. But you owe me dinner, somewhere nice, where they don't serve organic kale or have a dress code. Chapter 4. The Weight of the Sky. Man has always possessed a tragic, arrogant desire to conquer the sky. We build taller towers. We pave longer runways. We buy expensive, shiny toys with loud turbofan engines to carry us above the clouds, believing that if we can fly high enough, we can escape the gravity of our own limitations. We think that because we can look down on the world from a window, we own it. But the sky has its own ancient, unyielding laws, and the federal government, in its infinite bureaucratic majesty, possesses a set of rules that do not bend to wealth, political connections, or the petulant demands of a real estate developer. By Saturday morning, the storm had passed, leaving the valley air crisp, clean, and smelling of wet pine. At Skyline Estates, the grand opening was a spectacle of extraordinary vanity. A massive white pavilion had been erected next to the new $15 million runway. A brass band was playing lively marches, champagne corks were popping with festive frequency, and a crowd of wealthy investors. Local politicians and prospective buyers in expensive blazers stood on the tarmac, admiring the glistening black asphalt. They chatted about tax write-offs, golf handicaps, and the sheer convenience of fly-in lifestyle. At the head of the runway sat a beautiful $2 million Cessna Citation private jet, its twin turbofan engines idling with a high-pitched, expensive whine. It was owned by Victoria's husband, and it was scheduled to make the ceremonial first flight to inaugurate the runway, flying a loop over the valley before landing to a round of applause. Victoria Sinclair, standing on a decorated stage with a microphone in her hand, looked like she had recovered her confidence. Her attorneys had been working through the night, and she was convinced that her political connections would easily sweep away the temporary inconvenience of Victor's local sheriff wife. She wore a designer dress and a large, expensive hat, smiling as if she had already won. Welcome, distinguished guests, to the dawn of a new era. Victoria's voice boomed through the high-end outdoor PA system, echoing off the limestone facades of the surrounding mansions. Today we don't just open a runway. We open a gateway to the sky for those who demand nothing but the absolute best. I invite our patron, Mr. Sinclair, to take to the heavens. The crowd let out a polite, refined cheer. The pilot of the Cessna began to slowly advance the throttles, the jet beginning to roll forward onto the fresh, black tarmac, its tires whispering over the smooth surface. But before the aircraft could cover 50 feet, a sharp, high-frequency digital tone, a triple beep blared through the PA system and every aviation radio in the valley, cutting off the brass band and the announcer's microphone with a jarring, painful screech. It was the priority emergency broadcast signal of the Federal Aviation Administration. A deadpan nasal voice crackled over the emergency frequency, cold, professional, and completely devoid of human warmth. All aircraft at Skyline Runway, this is Regional Air Traffic Control. Stand down immediately. Extinguish all engines. I repeat, all propulsion systems must be shut down immediately. Victoria's face tightened. She grabbed her handheld aviation radio from her assistant, her voice cracking with fury as she stepped toward the edge of the stage. Control, what is the meaning of this? This is a private licensed runway. We have a cleared active flight plan with the State Transport Board. Negative, Skyline Control, the voice replied, calm, indifferent, and immovable. Your state flight plan has been suspended by order of the Federal Aviation Administration, Regional Director's Office. Effective immediately, a temporary flight restriction and a permanent restricted airspace zone has been established over your coordinates due to critical agricultural safety operations and federal encroachment violations. Any aircraft attempting to cat-cane will have its registration revoked and its crew detained under federal aviation safety protocols. Before Victoria could even scream a reply, a thunderous, rhythmic whoosh, whoosh, whoosh of heavy rotor blades began to shake the valley, drowning out the murmurs of the crowd. From the western ridge, 3 massive dark blue helicopters bearing the gold and white seal of the Federal Aviation Administration appeared. They flew in a perfect, tight military formation, sweeping low over the golf course, their powerful downdraft flattening the manicured grass, knocking over champagne tables and blowing the expensive silk hats off the heads of the horrified investors. The helicopters touched down directly in the center of the pristine $15 million runway, their pneumatic landing gear hissing as they took the weight. The side door of the lead helicopter slid open with a heavy metallic screech. Victor Vance stepped out onto the tarmac. He was no longer wearing his grease-stained overalls. He was dressed in the crisp, dark blue uniform of an FAA regional director, 4 thick gold bands gleaming on his sleeves, a pristine white pilot's cap resting on his head. His expression was completely blank, carrying the terrifying cold weight of a federal bureaucrat who had the power to ground an entire airline with a single signature. He held an official, blue-bound Federal Register in his hand. Victoria Sinclair marched toward him, her heels clicking furiously on the hot asphalt, her face red with rage, her expensive hat nearly blowing off in the helicopter's rotor wash. Victor, what is the meaning of this childish stunt? You are a crop duster. You spray weeds. You have no authority here. Victor looked at her, his voice through his megaphone, crystal clear, deadpan, and entirely calm. Good morning, Victoria. I hope the champagne is cold. You are disrupting a multi-million-dollar federal project. She shrieked, her voice cracking under the strain. My husband is personal friends with the Secretary of Transportation. We will have you dismissed by noon. You will be a private citizen by sunset. Your husband's friend is welcome to call my office, Victor said, thong them, opening the blue-bound folder with an air of complete indifference. But until then, we have to look at the Federal Register. According to Federal Aviation Regulation Part 77, any commercial or private runway constructed within 3 miles of an active, federally registered agricultural aviation facility must maintain a minimum clear clearance corridor of 1,000 yards. Your engineers, in their haste to avoid buying my land, laid this tarmac exactly 82 yards from my active hangar door. He looked up from the folder, his gaze sweeping over the beautiful, expensive runway. Which means, Victoria, that every square inch of this $15 million asphalt is an illegal federal safety hazard. Your runway is not an airport. It is a giant black obstruction on my flight path. And as the Regional Director of Airspace Control, I am here by revoking your operational permit. Effective 5 minutes ago, this airspace is closed. Permanently. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the long, pathetic, whining sigh of the Cessna Citation's engines as the pilot shut them down in defeat. The crowd of investors stood frozen, their champagne flutes trembling in their hands as they realized their exclusive multi-million-dollar flying community was now entirely landlocked. The dream of parking their private jets in their backyards had vanished, replaced by the terrifying reality of federal bureaucracy. And standing in the middle of it all was the very man they had tried to run out of the valley, looking as immovable and permanent as the mountains themselves. In the end, every artificial boundary must face the test of reality. Every wall that is built on another man's land, every line that is drawn in arrogance must eventually come down. Because the earth does not recognize human vanity, and the sky does not care about the name on a real estate brochure. The land only recognizes the deed, and when a man has the deed, the law and 20 tons of industrial diesel machinery on his side, the outcome is as inevitable and indifferent as the sunrise. By Monday morning, the grand white pavilions of the Skyline Estates Aviation Club had been dismantled, leaving only the empty tarmac shimmering under the hot valley sun. But the silence did not last long. A low, deep, earth-shaking rumble began to vibrate through the valley floor. It was a mechanical growl, the sound of multiple D9 armored bulldozers and heavy hydraulic concrete breakers moving in a slow yellow line from the Vance farm. At the head of the column stood Victor, wearing his old work boots and grease-stained cap alongside Grandpa Vance and Hank, the operator of their heavy recovery division. Victoria Sinclair stood on the other side of the property line, her face pale, her hair unkempt, looking like a ghost of her former self. Her lawyers had spent the weekend trying to find a federal injunction only to discover that the FAA's safety directives were absolute and non-negotiable. "Please, Victor. Please," Victoria whispered as she approached the boundary, her voice shaking all her high society arrogance, replaced by a raw, desperate panic. "The bank. They are going to call in our development loans today. The investors are going to sue us for fraud. I will lose my house. I will lose everything. Just leave the runway alone. We will pay you. We will buy your farm. We will give you $5 million, $10 million. Victor looked at her, then turned his gaze to the vast open fields of his farm, where the young cornstalks were just beginning to push through the dark, rich soil. "My grandfather planted his first crop of sweet corn on this land in 1948. Victoria," Victor said softly, his voice carrying the deep, quiet rhythm of the plains. "He did it with a single horse and a rusted plow. He paid for this land $20 at a time, with sweat and calluses. To us, this dirt isn't an asset to be traded. It's a promise we keep to the past. And you broke that promise when you cut down our 40 mature pine trees and poured this black poison on our pasture." Grandpa Vance added, his voice like iron. "We don't want your money, Mrs. Sinclair. We want our land back." Victor raised his hand, gesturing to Hank in the cab of the lead D9 bulldozer. "My family's demolition and recovery company, Vance & Sons, has been contracted by the federal government to clear this illegal airspace obstruction," Victor said. "Since the encroachment sits on my deeded property, we're going to start right here, at the property line." The bulldozer's engine roared, a deafening explosion of black smoke pouring from its exhaust stack as the massive steel blade lowered toward the ground. With a sickening, grinding crunch, the steel blade bit deep into the pristine $15 million asphalt, lifting a massive 3-ton chunk of tarmac and tossing it aside like a piece of cardboard. The hydraulic breakers began their rhythmic, thunderous pounding, pulverizing the black stone into tiny, useless fragments. Right along the exact property line, the bulldozers carved a clean 10-yard-wide deep trench directly through the center of the runway, splitting the grand project into 2 isolated, useless strips of broken black rock. As the dust rose into the morning air, a county patrol car pulled up. Sheriff Sarah Vance stepped out of the vehicle, a folder of legal documents in her hand. "Victoria Sinclair," Sarah said, her voice clear and official. "I have a warrant here from the federal prosecutor's office. You are being placed under arrest for federal airspace encroachment, environmental destruction of protected agricultural wetlands, and multiple counts of wire fraud for selling fly-in residential lots on land you did not legally own." The metallic click-click of the handcuffs closing around Victoria's wrist was sharp and final. She did not scream this time. She only stared at the massive ruined trench in the runway. Her eyes empty, her lips whispering, "But it was supposed to be perfect." Victor watched as the patrol car drove away, its tires kick up a small cloud of dust that quickly settled back into the road. The natural soundscape of the valley slowly returned. The wind rustled through the remaining corn leaves with a soft, soothing whisper. A meadowlark sang its sweet, clear song from the top of a white-painted steel post, and the small creek bubbled gently through the pasture. Victor walked back to his hangar, climbed into the cockpit of his Grummanag cat, and pulled his flight helmet over his ears. The massive radial engine roared to life with a beautiful, healthy, thunderous crescendo, the propeller spinning until it was nothing but a silver blur in the morning sun. He advanced the throttle, the plane rolling smoothly down his grassy runway, lifting off effortlessly into the wide blue unrestricted sky. And down below, the dust settled back into the furrow, because when the noise of human vanity finally fades, only two things remain: the earth below and the sky above. And neither one of them has a homeowners association.